All right, well, good morning, good afternoon. I wrote down a few thoughts. Should I open it with that? Are you guys interested in hearing that? Or?
Yes.
And then from there, I'll field any questions that you might have. Okay? Yesterday, I was invited to the White House along with a few other faith leaders to talk about an issue that I'm very passionate about, which is prison reform. Unfortunately, the political and cultural climate in our country has descended to a very petty and disturbing place. And because of that, I knew that going meant that there was a possibility that I would be attacked. Nevertheless, I accepted the invitation because I do believe that the ability to help others who are marginalized, disenfranchised, and voiceless is much more important than personal gain. For years, the Worship Center has been involved in prison ministry. We currently minister in 8 different prisons around Alabama each month, and hundreds of current and former prisoners have come to the Lord as a result of us serving in those prisons. In fact, some of our current members and a few of our leaders in this ministry were incarcerated at some point, but they've given their lives to Jesus. They've turned their lives completely around. And so contrary to popular opinion, I don't believe that the sum total of a person's life is defined by the mistakes they made. I really do believe that there's more to a person than their worst mistake or their worst failure. So while the United States makes up only 4.4% of the world's population, many of you are aware it houses 22% of the world's prisoners, and the overwhelming majority of those prisoners are African American or other minorities. African Americans only make up 12 to 13% of America's population, but they make up 35% of the prison population. This is not to mention the deplorable state of prisons in Alabama, particularly. Alabama prisons, according to certain statistics, are somewhere near 173% above capacity. And this overcrowded nature of our prisons exacerbates issues like mental health, civil rights violations, safety, and decency issues. So it was in light of all of these concerns that I accepted this invitation to the White House to discuss prison reform. President Trump's administration seems to be concerned about the issue, and what they did is they asked me, along with other faith leaders, to come and share our thoughts about it. This administration is currently working on prison reform legislation called the First Step Act, and it does have bipartisan support. During my first visit to the White House that happened earlier this year, they asked me to weigh in on my thoughts about the bill. I was brutally honest about my concerns, particularly with the way that the bill was originally constructed. And to my surprise, they welcomed my feedback and my concerns. Now, much has been made about my comments to President Trump yesterday, particularly the comments when I said, alluded to his care for all people. Some individuals have incorrectly interpreted that statement to mean a blanket endorsement of everything he's done, and that was not the intent of my statement. What was not captured by the media was the way that the meeting actually ran. It started off with us in the cabinet room, and we were having discussion about the prison reform issue. He entered the room and shared some of his heart on the issue, particularly prison reform and workforce development. And then the media was invited in. He shared a few comments that still echoed the same. Many of you have seen the YouTube video. And then, unexpectedly, he did ask us to go around and share a few words. Much of what you heard from me and from everyone else that was addressed to him was in response to what he said earlier in the private session before the media was able to come into the room. So my statements about him caring for all people was strictly about this notion of prison reform. I have been very concerned about particularly how people of color have been marginalized and disenfranchised in the prison system for far too long. And while I know it's unpopular, I consented to go to the White House only because I'm hoping that we can move the needle on this issue. Now, there's some people who believe that I never should have gone, and that's debatable. I do hope that we can be the kind of people, and particularly as believers, where we can still sit down with people even if we disagree with them, for the voiceless and the disenfranchised. This was not about me. This was about hopefully seeing some change in an area that affects a ton of people that look like me. And so we've demonstrated our commitment to that for a long time. And that really was the framework of the comments that I made. So my position on this issue, particularly political and racial issues that have been really prevalent in our culture in this time, has been really well documented through a number of interviews that I've done, through a number of op-ed pieces that I've written. But I still remain committed to the cause of Jesus Christ. And I believe that that cause is bigger than politics and pettiness. I think a lot about Matthew 25 and 35 when Jesus says, and I won't read it all, but he just says, you know, when I was in prison, you fed me, or you visited me, and when I was homeless, you clothed me, or when I was sick, you took care of my needs. And the disciples asked, well, when did we do that? And he says, when you've done it unto the least of them, you've done it unto me also. That was really the heart of why I consented to go. I do believe that as believers, we're called to be a part of the solution and not the problem. I do believe that we as a ministry are here to help make a difference. And I believe that that transcends who's in the White House. I do recognize that maybe that's not the view of everybody, but that was really the heart behind why I went and why I said what I said. So thank you for allowing me to kind of share my heart on the issue, and I'll field any questions that you might have.
Do you understand how some in the community, though, may have taken that last statement that you made?
Sure.
Just wondering where it came from, because they look at the history.
Oh, absolutely.
Point to that President Trump has had.
Absolutely.
With numerous segments of the population, and it would seem as though it is far from caring and concern.
Well, I actually do. That's part of the reason why I went. And you have to understand that I was very conflicted when I got the first invitation. And my being conflicted was because of some of the very same reasons. But then I also began to reflect and ask the Lord, well, what if this is an opportunity for me to be a voice for people who feel like a part of their frustration is because they are not being heard, particularly as it relates to prison reform. And so one of the things that I hope that people will understand, the challenge with living in a soundbite generation is that anything can be spliced and cut up and then people can take it and run with it. My hope and prayer is that within the context of people understanding what those statements were about, that people would understand my heart on the issue. And once again, one of the things that our church has demonstrated very consistently is that we're committed to serving the community. We're committed to making a difference in the lives of people. And we're committed to being the hands and feet of Jesus. And so that's my heart on the issue, and that's why I've asked you all to come. I know that I've in many ways been vilified on social media, but I hope that as people get a chance to understand the heart behind it, that they'd be able to put those statements with a little bit more color and context.
What would you say to those that might say this was simply a photo op to help repair the president's reputation in the African-American community? Well,
and I've been asked that question. Several people reached out on Facebook and said, hey, I hope this wasn't a photo op. And my response to them was very simple. I can't speak for him. What I can speak, though, is for myself. And I did not go for a photo op. In fact, I did not know that media was going to even be there. And the very first time that I went a couple of months ago, media was not there. Now, there are people who said, well, you got to be smarter than that. Number one, you know, I'm a pastor. I am not a media professional. So I went with the understanding that this meeting was going to continue the conversation we had the very first time. The very first time I went a couple of months ago, it was a closed door meeting, no media. President Trump was not even there. I, along with a few other faith leaders, met with Jared Kushner and his team because they were in the early stages of creating the First Step Act. Now, that bill has passed the House. It has not passed the Senate. And they asked us to weigh in on it. And I did. I pulled the bill apart. I talked about some implicit bias and how they were going to mitigate that. One of the premises of the First Step Act is to build basically a rating system on prisoners that are coming out. So based on how they do in the prison system, that would be basically an evaluation system that would then rate, you know, if they were highly to be productive in society, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the things that I said in that earlier meeting, because the way that the bill was originally constructed is that the person that would come up with that evaluative system was Jeff Sessions and his team. And one of the main concerns that I raised in the first meeting was how are they going to deal with what I perceive to be potentially implicit bias. If there is someone that is responsible for evaluating prisoners coming out that doesn't have any sense of context or understanding, how are they going to deal with that? And I said very clearly, if you want my support, you have to address that. I said, I think the bill in its intent is good because we do need to move the needle on prison reform. And what I'm not comfortable with is us just pushing this off as a partisan issue while our prison system continues to fall apart. So my understanding going into this meeting on yesterday was that it was going to be a continuation of that. So once again, you know, perhaps I'm at fault for, you know, not thinking bigger than that, but that was why I consented to go.
As the pastors before you were speaking in such glowing terms, was there anything inside you that said this might not be playing well outside this room? And did that in any way help shape the words that you ultimately used?
You know, what I listened to was I listened to pastors that I think were trying to show respect, but also to be as authentic and genuine as possible. Now, there were some pastors in that room I knew once, number one, when they invite you, they don't tell you who's going to be there. And so when I arrived, you know, obviously there were pastors in that room. Some of them were friends of mine. There were some individuals that we have a different kind of theology on things. So you also have to kind of understand that the greater point is bigger than the individual issues. And so for me, when I said what I said, I was really trying to focus on the issue at hand and to not at the same time be pulled either way into are you for or you're against, because for me, I think that's a losing battle. I think whatever side of the issue as it relates to President Trump you end up on, you're going to have people that dislike you, hate you, love you. And so I think that's a losing proposition. What I tried to suggest is that, number one, I appreciate the fact, and if it is a photo op, maybe it is, but I'm surprised from this administration that this issue of prison reform has risen to the top of their agenda. And I'm hopeful that they will follow through on it. I cannot control that. But I did want those, particularly in the prisons that we see every single month in and around Alabama, to know that I went there thinking about them, trying to represent them, hoping that we can affect some change.
You talked about that, those comments you made were in response to what he said before the media was there, so
yes.
things no one's heard.
Yep.
You talk about those things that he said that warranted those?
Yeah, absolutely. He came in and talked about his desire to see more prison reform. And he even actually talked about how he has friends in business that have hired prisoners, and you know, by and large, you know, one of the things he said is that it's not that everybody did well, but he said a large percentage of them are doing well, and that there are a lot of companies that are there are some companies that he's aware of that are benefiting from hiring former prisoners. And so what he did was he just came in and just said, this is an issue that we're concerned about. This is an issue that we care about. And he actually thanked us. He said, I really appreciate the work that you guys have already been doing on this issue. Talked about Jared Kushner and his team that's been really spearheading this. But he also said, I appreciate the faith-based community for the things that you guys already do in and around the communities you serve. So it wasn't pompous, it wasn't arrogant, it wasn't egotistical. In fact, he was very gracious, he was very appreciative, and he just stressed that this is an issue that's important to him. And so when I responded, that's what I was responding to, because this is a hot button issue for me as well. I'm hoping that we can see change by way of prison reform.
When referring to Trump, Pastor Darrell Scott said this is probably going to be the most pro-black president that we've had in our lifetime. Do you agree with that?
You know, I think Darrell Scott obviously has a totally different relationship with the president than I do. That was my very first time even being around him. Darrell Scott has been advocating for the president from the very beginning. Those were his words, those were not mine. I can't speak to that. For me, it's proof. Proof is in your actions and in your behavior. Just as I said earlier about I'm hoping that we see movement with prison reform. We'll see. So in terms of who's pro-black or not, to me, that's based on your behavior, not in, you know, words that people are going to tout about you.
So were you shocked when you heard those comments?
I was a little bit, yeah.
So aside from being pro-black or white or whatever, you said that you thought he was caring.
Well, I thought on this issue, that's the key. And I want to make sure that people get that. It was this issue. What he came in, just to the question you asked me before, what he came in and talked about was not Iran, not Russia, not any of these other issues. He came in and talked about two things that are important to me and important to the state of Alabama: prison reform and workforce development. That was what he talked about. Those were the comments that he made, and those were the comments that I was responding to.
Well, did you all have any conversations after that meeting with Darrell Scott about the comments about him being the most pro-black Possibly in our time. Did you have any comments after that?
Sure,
meeting?
sure. Let me tell you what happened. So after the media left the room, we continued to have conversation about what else needs to happen and how the faith-based community can participate in really helping to move the needle with prison reform and workforce development. Shortly after we talked for a few more minutes about that with the president, he left, had other meetings, and we continued to discuss this issue with his team. Now, shortly after that, I had to actually leave and catch a flight, so I left the rest of the pastors, so I don't know if other pastors pulled Darrell Scott aside or not and addressed that comment. I'm not aware of that.
Was there any discussion about any financial contributions from the administration or the federal government to any of the churches that were involved?
One of the things that I said earlier in the previous meeting that I had with, the first meeting that I had with his administration, one of the things I said to Jared Kushner is the current way that the federal government is going about spending in this issue of prisons and prison reform, I just told him I thought it was a bad business model. And since I knew that Jared Kushner was a businessman, I appealed to that and said, there is a better way that we can approach prison reform that will affect more change and will actually cost less for the federal government. I put that out in the first meeting. There were a few other pastors that talked about the potential of incentivizing companies that hire more former prisoners. And one of the things that someone brought up is that there are some pieces that are already in place, that there are some benefits that companies already have. I don't know if that is happening actually in the state of Alabama, but that clergy group was from all over the U.S. So that statement that was made about how there already are some benefits for companies that hire ex-prisoners, I don't know if that was specific to Alabama. I'm not aware of that, but that did come up.
No specific contributions to churches?
No, not while I was in the, not while I was in the meeting.
Pastor Moody, two
Yes.
questions for you.
Sure.
First of all, at what point did you realize the comments that you made might have the response from folks back here, including some of your church members, that it had? And number two,
Sure.
Sitting here today, do you regret making those comments yesterday?
Sure. Well, I think the first inclination I received that those comments were taken out of context was I had a couple of members reach out to me on Facebook and say, you know, what was going on? And I explained it to them. Actually, on the plane, I sent a long Facebook note and said, here's what was going on. Here's what I said, why I said it. I don't regret the comments. What I regret is that maybe what I should have said right after was on these issues. But once again, I do appreciate anybody that tries to do anything to help the poor and the disenfranchised and the marginalized. And that's my heart on the issue, whether they be white or black. We have got to do more, and that's kind of my heart on that issue.
So how do you move forward? I understand that there's people that are upset, even some
Yeah.
people in your congregation. How
Sure.
do you move forward from this just going on?
Well, number one, I mean, I'm going to say something about it. I'm not hiding. I'm not trying to backstep or running away from going. So I will address it on Sunday morning and really pray, you know, that people, number one, would not be so reactive and judgmental. You know, one of the things that I think is a big burden for me is I think this is a part of how we got here in the first place. I think to the degree that we perpetuate a lot of criticism and judgment without having genuine conversation, I don't think that we're any better than the people that we're actually arguing against. I think at some point, you know, Bible even talks about, come let us reason together. I think at some point we've got to be able to sit down and have genuine conversation. Now, it doesn't always mean that we're going to agree with one another, but I do believe that we can disagree without being disagreeable. I know that I've been villainized and people have, you know, called me all kinds of names on social media, but it's interesting that these are individuals, number one, some of which could have come directly to me and say, what did you mean by that? And I hope that as a people, particularly in Alabama, if we're going to learn from our history, we live in the great state of Alabama that has a history of judgment, criticism, oppression, and marginalization, because instead of sitting down and talking to people, we judge them, vilify them without even knowing them. And I hope that history is a reminder of how deadly that can be. I believe, in the same words that Dr. King mentioned years ago, that darkness cannot drive out more darkness, only light can. And as a believer, I believe that we are called to be light bearers. And sometimes that means bringing light into a very dark dark situation. And unfortunately, that's where our country is, but we've got to address it. And I think that there are multiple ways that we can address it.
Did you share those invitations to the White House with your congregation before you went to the White House?
This recent one I didn't because I was traveling. You know, the White House doesn't give you a lot of advance notification. I got a notification a few days before, and I was traveling. We were actually on retreat with our staff, and so I left Nashville to go to D.C. The first time that I was invited, I did share with a few people a couple of days before because, as I said a moment ago, I was really concerned and was very close to not going. But once again, I felt really convicted that if I could go and make a difference for others, maybe this was the door that God was opening. So because this second trip I thought was a continuation of that, which in many ways it was, the only difference from this trip yesterday and the previous trip was that media came in for a split second, and so did the president. So in that regard, and with the time frame, I did not have a lot of time to speak to people in advance.
If you were invited to go back again, would you? And if you were invited to go back again and decided to go, would you let your congregation know?
Yeah, I definitely would let them know. You know, I think I would probably ask a few more questions about, you know, the role that media is going to play or they're not going to play. But, you know, to be honest with you, I don't know. I would be very prayerful, like I have been with these previous two visits, to really get a sense of should I go? Should I not go? Will this help? Will it not help? I had the opportunity to talk to some people who, you know, are on both sides and feel like, hey, there's nothing that can be done. But hope is a part of faith, and I am a person of faith. And I want to believe that even amidst the darkness and the challenges, that something good can still come out. And that's what I keep working towards.
Pastor Van, we'll accept one last question.
Did you expect this kind of backlash?
No, I didn't.
How surprised were you when you started seeing responses?
Yeah, I did not expect it, and I was very, very, very surprised. But at the same time, I guess it's, you know, indicative of the climate that we're in. Let's get Greg in.
There was no personal monetary gain for you. No, just to clear that up. Because
I paid my own way, paid my own hotel bill. I got nothing. In fact, one of the things that I said in my statement is I went in knowing that this probably was going to potentially have a negative impact. So there was no personal gain. I didn't go for personal gain. I didn't get anything out of this. Hopefully, what can come out of this is that those that don't have a voice, their lives can be impacted.
Pastor, did you have any similar invitations or conversations with the Obama administration?
That's a good question. Absolutely not. I was never invited to the White House under the Obama administration. And this is also something that I wrestled with. Honestly, I wish I could have gone, but I was never invited. And I don't know how you get on the list. I don't know about that. I don't know how. I was very surprised that they even knew anything about me. So I don't know the dealings. I don't know the inner workings of how do you get on the list? How do you not get on the list? I have no idea. I just received an invitation, and that was it.
Well, did you go through any of your local Congress people to get to the president?
No, absolutely not.
So you made no efforts to write the president?
No, I've never written the president a letter. But before yesterday, never seen him, never shook his hand, shaken anyone's hand. In fact, if you check my giving records, you probably would see politically I've given on the other side in the past. So.
And when was the meeting with Kushner? That was.
It was a couple of months ago. Yeah, it was a few months ago.
What month?
I can go back. It was, I think it was around April or so. I can go back and give you the exact date. Yeah.
So we want to thank all of you all for coming. Pastor Van has another meeting that he has to get to. So we thank you all for being here today. And if there are any other questions, my information is on the information that I sent, and you all can filter them through me.